Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world of cold stones and quiet hunger. A city of towering chimneys, flickering gaslight, and the endless shuffle of boots on wet cobbles. This is the darker side of Victorian London. Not the polished drawing rooms or grand train stations, but the alleys, arches and hidden corners where the forgotten slept. We're exploring what it was like to be homeless in the 1800s, in a place where the empire's wealth piled high, but never trickled down. A time when entire lives passed beneath notice. No names, no homes, just bodies moving slowly through the smoke. Before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these quiet historical journeys. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far this sleepy little community reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe get under a blanket, or let a fan hum softly in the background. Let's start our descent, slow and steady, into the heavy, fog-wrapped streets of Victorian London. Let's set the scene. London, in the middle of the 19th century, was not a city of clear skies or open air. It was a city of lingering haze, a suspended breath that never fully exhaled. The smoke sat heavy in the air, never quite lifting, never quite falling. It drifted low and slow through narrow lanes and over broad avenues, curling like old parchment along the brick walls and under the wrought iron gates that kept the world's edges neat for those who could afford them. It was not just fog, it was coal dust and soot, ground horse manure and chimney ash, factory smoke and human sweat, a grey miasma that dulled the outlines of buildings, turned white linens yellow overnight, and seeped into skin, lungs and thoughts. The city wore it like a damp wool coat, familiar, oppressive, and inescapable. By 1850, the industrial heartbeat of Britain pulsed strongest in London's core. Great black-plumed chimneys rose from mills and workshops, their bases tucked behind rows of terraced housing and timbered warehouses. Smoke spilled constantly from their stacks, mixing with the steam of boiling tanneries, the stink of curing hides, and the acrid scent of coal tar. The sky, when glimpsed, was often the colour of pewter, neither day nor night, but something between, a kind of suspended dusk. Beneath this sky sprawled a city both ancient and ever-changing. Crumbling medieval lanes pressed up against freshly laid brickwork, and the sounds of construction echoed through the districts where slums were being demolished, only to be replaced by new slums in different shapes. The streets themselves were alive with noise, the iron-clad wheels of carts clattering against stone, the dull thud of boots, the rattle of shop shutters, and always the low murmur of voices, endless and overlapping. Every surface bore the fingerprints of industry. The bricks were blackened from 100 winters' fires, the railings rusted from rain filtered through smoke. Even the air between buildings shimmered with a greasy thickness. In wealthier areas, carriages hurried past, their polished sides catching the faintest glint of the gas lamps, but the poor walked, slow, bent and shoeless, through puddles that were not only water, but a chemical soup of spilled ink, butcher's blood, and the slop from chamber pots emptied into gutters. London was loud, but it was also deeply tired. The fatigue of generations clung to the stones. The city was expanding outward at a relentless pace. Railways carving through neighbourhoods, steamships pushing up the Thames, and yet for the many who lived under eaves, in attics or between chimneys, there was no sense of movement. For them, time thickened and pooled like the fog itself. There was no future, only another hour, another step, another half-warm corner to curl into when night came. The smell of the city never left one's nostrils. A sour and layered scent, ash and mildew, coal and tallow, bread crusts, animal dung and river rot. Even the rain did not cleanse London. It only made the scent stronger, soaking through the city's pores and raising the ghosts of 100,000 lived-in days. The Thames, thick and brown, carried waste and bodies alike, and its banks drew in fog like a blanket. Barges moved slowly across its surface, dark shapes sliding past like thoughts no one wanted to speak aloud. On the edges of grand squares and long arcades, new construction advertised the wealth of a global empire. Cast iron shop fronts, gilded signage, imported granite facades, But between these displays of imperial confidence, there were other streets, narrow, forgotten, and deeply lived in, where the smoke did not drift but settled. In these alleys, between the stacked crates and behind the market stalls, the city revealed its quieter side, not silent, never silent, but muffled by grime and wear. This was the London where the homeless made their way, not always seen, but always there, living not just beneath the city's skyline, but beneath its notice. And in those alleys, those broken-toothed rows of brick and timber, where the gaslight barely reached and the smell of ash never lifted, the real story unfolded. A story of bodies without beds, of hands that scraped for warmth, of sleep taken where one could find it, and meals built from what others threw away. As the smoke curled slowly around chimney pots and drifted downward into those thinner streets behind the butchers and fishmongers, it wrapped itself around figures who would never pass through the stone arches of London's great buildings. There, in the quiet recesses behind the Empire, beneath windows shut tight against the fog, the homeless moved, slowly, quietly, and almost invisibly, through the world they were born into and left behind by. And it was in these spaces, between soot-blackened walls and rusted iron fences, that they laid their hands upon the cold stone at night, searching for a place to rest. There were streets in London that were never named on maps, not officially. They were the spaces between places, the alleys behind the Empire, behind the tea shops and the apothecaries, behind the banks with their brass plates and polished handles. These were the thin, cracked corridors running between slaughterhouses and ironworks, where the stone walls sweated and the shadows never quite retreated, even by day. It was here, in these forgotten veins of the city, that a quieter population gathered, not visitors, not residents, but lingerers in the folds of the city's coat. These alleys, sometimes no wider than a man's outstretched arms, twisted irregularly between older buildings that had slumped over time, their bricks bowing slightly inward or outward depending on the weight of their history. Drain pipes, ancient and split, clung to the sides of these buildings like limp vines, weeping dirty water onto the flagstones below. Laundry lines hung above, slack and stained, with garments stiff from exposure to soot-heavy air. From these second and third-story windows came the low mutter of family rooms crammed too tight, where even the housed lived on the edge of endurance. At street level, the alleys carried the sediment of a city in motion. Straw trampled into mud, cabbage leaves trodden flat, paper soaked through and dark as coal. Crates were stacked unevenly beside back doors, barrels rolled against flint walls, and carts leaned on their axles like tired beasts, their wheels half submerged in pooled rainwater. These were not the curated avenues where London's face was presented to the world, but the hollowed back rooms of the capital, where everything unwanted was stored, hidden, or forgotten. And it was here, in these tucked-away spaces, that the homeless found their rhythm. They were not always visible at first. They moved slowly and without haste, not out of laziness but because there was nowhere to be. To move quickly was to admit purpose, and purpose had long since been stripped away by hunger and rain, and the gradual wearing down of the self. Some crouched beneath the rear awnings of butcher shops, curled beside barrels that offered just enough shelter from the wind. Others gathered in half-roofed yards between buildings, where the ground was soft with decades of rubbish, and sleep could be snatched between patrols and footfalls. Behind Covent Garden, in the narrow passages between theatre doors and produce stalls, men and women dozed in the afternoons, heads resting on sacks of spoiled potatoes, hands tucked beneath threadbare coats. Children with eyes too old for their faces scuttled through market refuse, turning over cabbage heads and fish bones, looking for something, anything, that hadn't yet turned to rot. There were hundreds like them, nameless in the census, remembered only in passing by shopkeepers and sweepers, who saw their outlines each morning, and knew better than to ask questions. There were spaces beneath wooden stairwells where the homeless nested like pigeons, low-ceilinged cubbies that stank of urine and smoke. Old cellar doors left ajar offered entry to the deep underbelly of buildings, where rats and men competed for space beside forgotten barrels and crumbling brick. Some slept beneath covered carts, resting between the wheels on burlap sacks that once held oats or barley. These wagons were not theirs to claim, and their presence was always temporary. until the driver returned, until a constable passed, until the weight of another cold hour pushed them on. In the crowded yards of Shoreditch and Southwark, entire families could be found huddled together beneath sheets of canvas, propped up with crate wood and weighed down with rocks. These makeshift shelters were not homes, but they offered the illusion of boundary, a thin line between self and the outside world, enough to suggest a kind of existence, even if no one else acknowledged it. Rain tapped lightly on the canvas as smoke from nearby chimneys drifted low, blending with the breath of those curled beneath. The soundscape of these alleys was a constant low hum, not the clamour of horse-drawn carriages, or the cry of newspaper boys, but a quieter symphony, the shifting of limbs against stone, the whisper of damp cloth, the murmur of a half-heard cough in the next corner. Rats scratched inside crates, and dripping gutters plinked steadily into cracked bowls or rusted tins. Every now and then the silence broke, the clatter of boots, the bang of a slammed window, or the sharp hiss of someone being chased from a sleeping place by a landlord or watchman. Yet for all their bleakness, the alleys held a strange, grim rhythm. People learned where to avoid the worst smells, where the wind was least cruel, which stone ledges stayed driest in the rain. Habits formed, routines, even, in the spaces between rejection and survival. A certain doorway near Whitechapel was known for its warmth, thanks to a bakery oven on the other side of the wall. A crooked fence behind a rag shop had a hole just wide enough to slip through and find shelter beneath a disused lean-to. Knowledge like this passed quietly between the homeless like whispered scripture, never written down, never shared outside the circles of those who had nothing left to lose. The deeper one drifted into these spaces, the more the city changed. It no longer looked like a capital. The grandeur of Westminster and the spires of churches faded into memory. Here, the city hunched its shoulders and muttered to itself. The iron of the fences was rusted, the wood of the doors splintered, the signs above the shops faded and crooked. Time did not stop in these places, it just did not matter. And yet the alleys went on. They forked endlessly into other alleys, led to blind ends and crooked yards, descended stairs to hidden courts, or rose through tight stone corridors that caught the sound of every footstep like a drum. It was in one such turn, behind a row of fish stalls near the river, that a narrow arch led to a soot-blackened court, where the sun rarely touched the ground. And in that court, beneath the eaves of a collapsed shed and beside a pile of discarded barrels, someone sat hunched in silence, their eyes half-lidded, their breath shallow, their hands folded not in prayer but in surrender to the long hours ahead. And it was in these corners, behind the market stalls and beyond the sound of traffic, that the city's invisible residents waited for darkness, not because night offered comfort, but because it allowed them to vanish completely, if only for a few hours more. When night finally came to London, it did not arrive all at once. It seeped slowly into the city like ink into cloth, darkening corners first, then stairwells, then entire courtyards. Daylight never truly illuminated the alleys where the homeless drifted, but even the grey glow of afternoon faded eventually, replaced by the flicker of gaslight and the long stretch of shadows that came with it. It was then, in those pale hours between dusk and dark, that the city changed its posture. The noise softened, the sharp shouts of vendors grew distant, swallowed by brick. Shopkeepers dragged heavy shutters into place, their iron hinges grinding in rhythm with the drawing down of the day. Barrow boys gave their last calls, collecting leftover fruit too bruised to sell. Chimneys puffed a little harder, coal stoves rekindled for the evening meal behind polished windows and tightly latched doors, but not every corner of London closed so cleanly. For the homeless, nightfall did not mark the end of labour, but the beginning of stillness, a stillness not of rest but of retreat. As the richer homes and better-fed families turned inward, to firelight and stew and candle-lit rooms, those outside began to drift into the background of the city, like breath fading from a window pane. The gas lamps, placed at regular intervals along the broader streets and near better housing, cast halos of sickly yellow light onto wet cobbles, but the alleys, the courts and the sunken yards behind the markets were left to the dark, or to flickers that failed to reach the ground. Gaslight had a strange quality. It did not dispel the dark so much as scatter it. Figures passed briefly through the yellowed glow, only to dissolve again into shadow. The light gave a dull sheen to puddles, caught the brass buttons of a constable's coat, outlined the edges of buildings without revealing anything of what lay within. Windows glimmered faintly above, where families moved behind curtains. The glow never touched the homeless. They remained shadows themselves, ragged and indistinct. Those without shelter found what cover they could: a half-collapsed crate, a bent sheet of tin, an old chair with only 3 legs and no seat. Some crouched in the recessed entryways of shops now closed for the night, curling into themselves beside door frames, resting against the cold iron grates drawn across storefronts. Others moved to familiar corners: the broken wall behind the pie seller's stall, the arch beside the fishmonger's chute, and arranged their bodies to match the angles of brick and stone, becoming part of the structure until morning pushed them out again. There was no speech in these hours. Not really. Murmurs, perhaps. A cough, a shuffled footstep, a groan from beneath a mound of rags. The conversations had already been had, and nothing new was left to say. Those who still had their voices often saved them, as if words were calories, to be rationed carefully. The city itself whispered louder than they did. Drips from gutters, the low moan of wind through alley pipes, a wagon rattling home down a distant lane, the chime of a church bell counting out hours that did not matter. Children, those still awake, clutched cloth sacks or hunks of bread stolen from barrows, their faces ghost-like in the dark. Some nestled between sleeping parents, others curled in doorways alone, legs pulled to chests, fingers pressed to mouths not from hunger, but to stay unnoticed. Night made them disappear more gently than day ever could. In darkness, they were no longer watched, only passed by. The fear of being seen was replaced by the fear of being remembered. In wealthier quarters, gas lamps lined wide boulevards and stood tall at park gates, casting clear light onto polished boot tips and fresh-pressed wool. The flicker of fire behind glass reflected in rain-soaked pavement, doubling the sense of warmth and order. Dogs barked behind fences. Inside parlors, piano keys danced beneath soft fingers. On the other side of the street, in the park's shadow, or the stable yard's corner, a man huddled beneath a blanket that was not truly a blanket, only layers of clothing sewn together. His breath misted before him, caught for a moment in gaslight, then gone. Those without shelter moved slowly. There was no rush in the dark. Nothing opened, nothing called. The best one could hope for was to be left undisturbed, to find a place not already taken, not recently washed down by city sweepers, not patrolled too often. The wrong place brought trouble, a boot to the ribs, a night in the cells, or worse, no place left at all. So the homeless kept to shadows, moved with caution, and claimed the smallest corners of the city for sleep. Not all managed to rest. Some sat upright, backs against stone, heads nodding but never falling fully into sleep. Others paced to stay warm, tracing short lines through courtyards, past the same shutters and steps. The dark stretched long, and the cold longer still. Hands were tucked beneath arms, legs drawn up, feet flexed and unflexed to keep blood moving. Even beneath layers of tattered coats, the chill seeped through, not a sudden shock, but a gradual claiming of limbs, an ache that became the only companion. And still, the gas lamps flickered. The flame inside each lamp pulsed with a life of its own, brightening and dimming in slow rhythm, as though the city itself were breathing in sleep. But it was not sleeping, not truly. It was waiting. Some nights, fog would roll in thick from the river, muting even the gaslight's dim reach. In that fog, shapes became more uncertain. A cart might become a figure might become a bundle of clothes, and a bundle of clothes, upon closer glance, might be a sleeping man, mouth open, fingers curled loosely around nothing. Silence grew thicker with the fog, and the city's edges disappeared altogether. And in that silence, behind the locked doors and below the glowing windows, lay the long hours of the forgotten, not sleeping peacefully, not dreaming, not sheltered from wind or law or sickness, only enduring. The city outside was still alive, but quieter now. And for those with no bed and no key, and no name on any record, the shadows had become their only roof, their only room, their only refuge. They would remain there until dawn, unmoving, unseen, their bodies wrapped in rags, their eyes closed against the gaslight. And when the first grey hints of morning returned, when the lamplighters made their slow rounds again with poles to snuff the flames, the ragged figures would begin to stir. They would stand slowly, their joints stiff, their feet soaked, their mouths dry. They would gather their few belongings, if any, and drift once more into motion, toward whatever the day might hold. Some would head toward the river banks, toward work that offered no wage but the chance of a scrap or a bone. Others would walk the markets before stalls opened, looking for what had been thrown out the night before. But most would drift toward the edge of the city's waste, not just the physical waste, but the cast-off remains of value, the discarded and overlooked, and begin the quiet search for something they could carry, something they could sell, something to keep the long hours moving forward. Morning in London arrived, not with sunlight, but with the soft metallic clatter of shutters rising, and the groan of barrows rolled out onto cobbled streets. The city never truly slept, but it did stir, slowly, as if reluctant to acknowledge the day. A pale grey haze crept through the alleyways, where shadows had pooled through the night. Lamplighters moved along their routes, extinguishing the last flickers of gaslight. The streets, still wet from the morning mist or the previous night's rain, glistened faintly under the growing light, though no warmth came with it. And from the darkest corners of the courts and yards, figures began to emerge. They unfolded slowly from their curled sleeping positions, their limbs stiff from stone, from cold, from stillness. The first task of the day was always the same movement, however small, a step, a breath, a shifting of shoulders beneath soaked coats. There was no rush, only the soft urgency of knowing that anything left behind, a bag, a rag, a bundle of crusts, might not be there upon return. For those without coin, without trade, and without roof, there were only a few occupations that offered even the faintest hope of survival. They were not jobs in the formal sense. There were no ledgers, no bosses, no wages, only the hunt for what others no longer wanted. This quiet desperation unfolded in silence, and always with bowed heads. Down by the river, where the tide revealed muddy banks, and the smell of rot hung thick in the air, the mudlarks began their slow descent. Men, women and children, most of them barefoot, stepped cautiously down the embankments, careful of the slime-slicked stones, the sharp glass, the rusted nails. The Thames was generous in its filth. It carried the waste of the largest city in the world, and sometimes within that waste, there was something to be found. A coin dropped from a ferry passenger's pocket, a scrap of rope, a bent spoon, nails, copper wire, bits of coal. The work was cold and dangerous. The tide waited for no one. It swept in silently, without pity, and had taken many who did not climb quickly enough. But the promise of a farthing, a single farthing, was enough to lure the desperate down into the muck. Children as young as 6 combed the mud with sticks or bare hands, pulling broken combs and bones from the silt, blinking against the sting of wind and salt. A little further inland, in the streets behind the slaughterhouses, bone pickers began their rounds. They did not collect meat, there was none. They gathered the remnants, skull fragments, jawbones, femurs, ribs, the brittle leftovers cast into gutters behind butcher stalls, or dropped from carts making deliveries to inns and kitchens. Bones were boiled down into glue, crushed into powder for fertilizer, or burned for charcoal. The pickers moved with sacks slung over their shoulders, prodding at rubbish heaps with long metal hooks, lifting what they could carry, discarding what was too rotten, too soft, too infested. These were not tasks for the strong, they were not noble labors, or even recognized ones. There was no dignity in it, but there was rhythm, a way of moving, bending, sorting, a knowledge of where the horses had fallen the week before, where the waste carts dumped their contents late at night, which alleyways were overlooked by the sweepers, and therefore richest in leavings. The stench was not noticed by those who lived in it. It was only air. Rag gatherers followed behind the carriages, behind the market wagons, behind the long stream of people who shed cloth without thought. A torn bonnet, a stained waistcoat, a strip of curtain thrown from a boarding house. These too could be sold to paper mills, to rag merchants, to factories that used the fibers to make packing or coarse cloth. The rag pickers, many of them women with aprons already grey from grime, moved silently between piles of refuse. They used long fingers to sort through dung, broken crockery, and damp straw. There was no shame, only necessity. Most carried sacks that once held flour or oats. They filled them slowly, careful not to tear the weakened seams. Some worked in pairs, though most moved alone. Companionship was rare, and often short-lived. When one lived on crumbs and shreds, even kindness became a kind of luxury. The rattle of bones in a canvas sack, the clink of tin spoons against glass bottles, the wet slap of bare feet against mud. These were the sounds of the scavengers' world. No clock ruled them, no employer's bell marked their time. They moved with the sun, and the streets and the scent of waste. The city's rhythm was their rhythm, not because they followed it, but because they had been pushed into its blind spots, and there found the only pattern left. Their hands were always busy, lifting, turning, scraping. Their fingernails blackened, their skin chapped from cold and rot, eyes red from soot and smoke, bodies curled inward from years of exposure and slow starvation. There were no gloves, no proper tools, no protection of any kind. Disease travelled as freely as the wind. Cholera, typhus, consumption, a cough could mark the beginning of the end, but still they worked, because the body did not stop needing food when the lungs grew weak. Few spoke, words were spent carefully, saved for bartering or pleading. The face of the scavenger was blank, not from lack of feeling, but from the exhaustion of needing too much and receiving too little. Expressions cost energy, they conserved what little they had, and still the work continued. From dawn to midday, from midday to dusk, every item found was lifted with slow hope. Was it copper? Was it bone? Was it cloth thick enough to patch a coat? Most of it was not. Most of it was just rubbish, rot, and remains. But the search could not be abandoned. Hunger did not pause, and cold did not wait. And so they moved through the back lanes, the riverbanks, the refuse heaps, their silhouettes hunched and shifting behind broken fences, their shadows passing briefly beneath crooked signs. They made their way back to the alleyways where they would rest, their bags heavier but their bodies lighter, their hands full but their bellies still empty. The sun would fall again soon, the gas lamps would flicker once more, the alleys behind the city would fill again with figures becoming still, curling against walls, folding beneath stairs. The day's findings would be hidden under rags, or clutched tightly in sleep, and when hunger returned in the middle of the night, when the chill pressed deepest into skin and bone, they would dream, if they dreamed at all, of scraps that were just a little cleaner, bones that had not yet been picked, and a place by the river where the tide did not reach quite so fast. Hunger in London was not dramatic. It did not howl or wail. It sat quietly, settled deep in the stomach like a second spine, persistent, familiar, and always just slightly worse than the day before. For the homeless poor, it was not a matter of feasting or fasting. It was the steady rhythm of insufficiency. A crust here, a spoonful there, a missed day followed by another. The body learned in time to expect nothing. The city offered food in abundance, if viewed from the wrong angle. Market stalls overflowed with barrels of salted herring, baskets of bread, mounds of potatoes still crusted with soil. But these displays were for buyers, not scavengers, and even the refuse was often guarded, watched carefully by owners, who knew their rubbish still held value to someone. For the homeless, feeding the body was not a mealtime, but a strategy, a day-long calculation of where to be, when to arrive, how to ask, or how to avoid being noticed at all. In certain streets, shopkeepers might toss bruised fruit into the gutter, knowing it would vanish before it hit the stones. Elsewhere, a baker might press a misshapen crust into the hand of a child who didn't ask. But these were not promises, only rare gestures, forgotten as quickly as they happened. Behind taverns, where meat was cut, and ale spilled freely for those inside. The bins filled early. Offal, fish heads, bread ends hardened into stone. These piles, often soaked in beer or bile, were picked over by the first to arrive. Rats first, and then men. A cracked onion, a carrot too soft for cooking, a bone still faintly streaked with fat. Hands worked quickly in the dark, moving aside wrappers, lifting lids, scraping what little was left from the undersides of trays. Not far from the markets, behind the tangle of shipping lanes and warehouses, soup kitchens opened their doors, not with warmth, but with order. Long lines of the ragged and the hollow-eyed stood in silence beside iron gates, waiting for the clang of the first ladle. The smell of boiled lentils or barley reached them long before they reached the bowls. It was not the scent of satisfaction. It was thin, metallic, barely food at all. But it was hot, and it was given, and that was enough. Inside, there were rules. No pushing, no speaking, no second helpings. You received what you were handed, and moved along. The broth, ladled into dented tin cups or wooden bowls, was often more water than substance. A few beans, a strand of cabbage, a flake of gristle if one was lucky. Bread, if offered, was hard and dry, scraped from the corners of a bakery's leftover crate. But for many, it was the only warm thing they'd know that day. Some of the charitable kitchens were run by churches. Here, the poor were fed scripture before food. The reading of verses came first, followed by prayers, and finally the thin meal served from steaming vats that never seemed to steam quite enough. The pews were filled with bent backs and empty stares, not from piety, but from exhaustion. Even the act of bowing one's head in prayer took strength that many no longer possessed. For those too sick or too slow to reach the kitchens in time, there was nothing but the streets. Children with soot-streaked cheeks waited outside bakehouses, hoping for a crumb to fall. Elderly women with shawls wrapped tight against their ribs leaned against walls, silent, unmoving, invisible. Some picked at the edges of market waste with bird-like precision, separating the half-rotted from the fully spoiled. Others wandered with empty sacks and hollow hands, waiting for nothing in particular, only the off chance that someone somewhere had just enough pity to spare a bite. It was a hunger that blurred the hours. There were no breakfasts, lunches, or suppers, only moments when something might be eaten, and longer stretches when nothing was. Time passed slowly when the stomach was empty. It dulled the senses, pressed leaden weight into the limbs, made thoughts wander. Some fell asleep beneath blankets of newspaper, with bread still clutched in hand, too tired to eat it. Others shared what little they had, not out of generosity, but out of an understanding that it could be them next time, without even a crust. There were makeshift markets too, not for buying, but for bartering. A spoon for a slice of bread, a strip of cloth for a boiled potato. Bits of food changed hands quietly beneath arches and behind coal bins. No law regulated this exchange. It was built on trust, necessity, and silence. In the colder months, the hunger deepened. The body burned more in the cold, but there was nothing to replace what it lost. Some chewed rags soaked in water, only to feel the illusion of fullness. Others boiled stones or straw to make the air smell like something had been cooked. By February, in especially bitter years, the death toll from starvation climbed in the workhouse infirmaries, and on the frozen stoops where people simply didn't rise again. But hunger wasn't always a slow wasting. It could be sharp, too. When meat spoiled in the summer heat, when river fish turned bad, when bread carried mold not easily seen in the dark, the results were fast. Sickness spread through the homeless like smoke, burning through bodies already too fragile to resist. Vomiting, fever, delirium. And still, once recovered, they returned to the same places, the same piles, the same hand-me-downs from the city's waste. And in those moments, when a dry crust was found beneath a bench, or a strip of salted meat was shared among three, there was no celebration, only chewing. Silent, slow, chewing. Tired jaws, cracked lips, broken teeth. Food did not taste of anything anymore. It only filled space, temporarily. By evening, hunger returned again like the fog, creeping, familiar, never entirely gone. The soup kitchens closed their gates, the markets shuttered, the taverns turned their bins inward, and those who had eaten stood no taller than those who had not. The difference was only in the hours ahead, slightly less ache, slightly more warmth behind the ribs. And so they returned to the cracked pavement, to the alleyways, to the boarded sheds and soot-blackened yards. Some clutched crusts for later, others scraped tin cups with wooden spoons long after they were empty, chasing the ghost of flavour. The gaslights flickered, the city exhaled its smoke, and beneath it, 1,000 stomachs clenched quietly in the dark, not in protest, but in patience, because hunger, like cold, was a part of the city, constant, impersonal, and always waiting. Evening in London was not a descent into silence, but a shift, a changing of texture, of tone. The clamour of carts gave way to the distant echo of footsteps, the clatter of markets fell quiet, and in its place came the subtle groaning of buildings settling, the occasional bark of a dog, the distant toll of a clock tower, somewhere beyond the mist. The fog thickened in the night hours, not dissipating, but rather curling tighter against the city's skin. Gas lamps flickered low behind streaked glass, casting pale yellow pools that looked like they might hum if one stood close enough, but the lamps gave little warmth and less comfort. For those without homes, the night was not a time for rest. It was a space to be endured, minute by minute. Some wandered until their legs refused to carry them further. Others sat in doorways until sleep came, as something more like unconsciousness, brief, broken, unsettled. Sleep, if it happened at all, was a moment stolen, not granted. There were places to lie down, but few where one could truly sleep. The underside of stairwells, the damp corners of alleyways, the cold iron shadow beneath a cart. Some chose the lip of a factory wall, or the space beside a chimney's outer brick, where a trace of warmth might cling from the day's fire. Others sat upright on stone steps, coats drawn over knees, heads bowed, not in prayer, but in exhaustion. Some made arrangements, small ones, like padding a nook with torn newspapers, or stuffing straw into the seams of a broken boot. But these were gestures of habit, more than hope. The city did not sleep in the way rural places did. Its breath was always moving. Somewhere, even in the deepest part of the night, there would be footsteps, not many, but enough. The constable making his round, his boots crisp against the stone, a milkman stirring early, a man with no business, simply walking, and the horses, fewer now, but not gone. Their hooves rang dully against the cobbles, dragging the sound behind them like a sheet. Noises at night did not scare those who lived without shelter. The fear was not in what might be heard, but what might come in silence. The body, with no cushion beneath it, and no roof above, did not rest easily. Bones pressed against brick, ribs ached against wood, muscles twitched and spasmed, trying to curl tighter into themselves. The cold did not bite in an instant. It seeped, through cloth, through skin, into marrow. Fingers stiffened, toes lost their memory. Some wrapped themselves in whatever fabric they owned, not for comfort, but to keep the breath from escaping. The body, when cold enough, forgets how to dream. Rain was its own agony, not the sudden downpour, but the long drizzle that softened everything. It made the stones slick, the air heavy, the skin damp for hours at a time. No place was dry. Archways dripped from their seams, overhangs leaked down one side. Even under wagons, the mist clung, and with dampness came sickness. That quiet, creeping cough that began in the chest and stayed, week after week, like a bell tolling inside the body. Some covered their mouths not out of politeness, but because coughing too loudly at night could attract attention, and not always the helpful kind. There were groups who clustered together, sharing heat more than trust. Not gangs, not families, just bodies near bodies. Some slept back to back for warmth. Others took turns resting, one keeping an eye open, while the other drifted into a half-sleep. But even among the homeless, space was limited. Doorways only fit 2, 3 at most. Beneath the Blackfriars Bridge, more might gather, huddled like driftwood, pressed tight against the stone supports. But even here, peace was thin. Arguments over space, over scraps, over silence. These were common, if subdued. Not everyone made it through the night upright. There were mornings when bodies did not rise. A man who had sat too long without moving. A woman whose hands would not uncurl. The cold was not always the killer. Exhaustion often did the work first. A heart simply giving out. The lungs ceasing their effort. A collapse that felt no different than sleep, until one realized the chest would not rise again. And so the nights were long. Not because they were longer on the clock, though the winter evenings stretched cruelly, but because each minute held its own weight. 1,000 discomforts, a dozen small dangers, and no way to soften them. The air itself seemed to resist the passing of time. Clocks ticked, yes, but only in houses behind locked doors, where blankets were thick, and the lamps burned low and steady. The homeless listened not for clocks, but for light. The pale, grainy hint of dawn, filtering through the soot-streaked fog. It didn't arrive all at once. It crept in at the edges, softening corners, lifting shadows just slightly. That was how they knew it was over. Not because they'd rested, but because the worst part was done. By early morning, the city stirred again. Shopkeepers opened shutters. Chimneys breathed out black ribbons. Bread carts rolled slowly into the squares. And those who had made it through the night blinked their way upright. Some stretched limbs that had gone numb. Others checked their shoes to see if they'd been stolen. Blankets were shaken out. Faces washed with puddle water. It was the beginning of another day, and like every day before it, there would be walking and waiting, and the same long search for food and shelter. The night, though gone, left its mark. In aching joints, in hollow cheeks, in eyes too tired to blink often. But it also left something else. The fragile, thin-skinned relief of survival. They had made it through one more stretch of darkness, and in that small invisible victory, they returned again to the movement of the city, walking slowly, holding their silence, eyes on the pavement, not on the sky, because the night would come again, as it always did, and sleep, if it came, would come without comfort, without warmth, and without a name. By the time the sky had lightened, and the smoke from the chimneys began to drift straight rather than curl, the city had shifted into motion again. But among those who had passed the night beneath arches, or under the lingering fog, there was no urgency. The sun, such as it was, brought no change to their condition, only a gentler shade of grey by which to measure the day. Their movements were slow, not idle, but deliberate. Hunger still dragged behind every step, and sleep had left no nourishment in its place. There were some among them who did not return to the streets at night, at least not entirely. Instead, they pooled their pennies, or guarded a precious coin throughout the day, for what passed as shelter in the deeper quarters of the city. These were not homes, nor were they truly safe, but they offered something that resembled a place to sleep, indoors beneath a roof, with some semblance of structure around it. The Doss House. They bore many names: lodging houses, penny sit-ups, 4-penny coffins, or simply the Doss. Scattered in the poorer boroughs, they occupied the upper rooms of tenements, converted warehouses, or brick buildings whose plaster had long since surrendered to soot. Some were officially registered, others operated in the shadow between legality and disinterest. Regulation, where it existed, was a loose and sagging net. Inside, the atmosphere was thick, not with conversation. There was little talk, but with the smell of close bodies, stale breath, damp cloth, and old dust. Air did not move easily in those rooms. The walls sweated when the bodies pressed too closely together. Windows, if they existed, were rarely opened. Too cold in winter, too dangerous in summer. What was paid for, in truth, was not comfort, but stillness. A person paid not to be moved on, not to be arrested for loitering, not to be noticed. For a few pennies, one could exist for a night, without being prodded by a constable's boot, or jolted awake by the wheels of an early cart. The arrangements varied. For the poorest, there was the 2-penny rope, a thick cord, stretched from one end of the room to another, sagging beneath the weight of slumped bodies. A man or woman could lean forward over it, arms dangling, chin against their chest, and doze there until morning. It was sleep, only in the technical sense. Muscles trembled from holding posture, necks stiffened, and when the keeper of the house cut the rope at dawn, as was the custom, every sleeper tumbled forward in a mass of startled limbs, groaning and blinking in the grey morning light. For a few pennies more, there were the coffin beds, not truly coffins, but close enough, narrow wooden boxes, some with lids, others open, stacked in rows along the floor, or against the walls like drawers in a worn-out cabinet. Inside, a thin layer of straw or rag offered something softer than the floor, though not by much. Privacy was a fiction. Noise bled through the walls, if there were walls at all. One man's cough became another man's lullaby. The sound of a woman sobbing quietly in the far corner might continue long into the night, absorbed by no one, and answered by nothing. Then there were the benches, plain wooden boards, sometimes with a back, sometimes not, where for a single penny one could sit for the night, sitting, not lying. To lie down was to cross the invisible line, into a different tier of lodging, one that cost more. So men sat, shoulders pressed together, heads bowed, knees drawn up. They slept in shifts, if they slept at all. Some guards or keepers walked the aisle, tapping with sticks, if someone slumped too far or tried to stretch out. These places were not quiet, nor were they peaceful. In the darkness, the soundscape was a tapestry of sleep's absence, coughing, wheezing, murmured arguments, the rustle of fleas or lice being scratched at beneath collars. There was snoring, yes, but rarely the deep, relaxed kind. More often it was the rough breath of a body, too exhausted to breathe quietly. Children sometimes cried in their sleep, others whimpered without tears, voices too tired to wake. For the owners of such houses, the business was simple and profitable. A few dozen coffin beds, some benches, a stretch of rope, and each night, pennies poured in from those with no choice. Hygiene was not a concern. Illness spread with ease. Consumption, as it was then called, passed hand to hand, breath to breath, unnoticed until someone simply failed to rise one morning. There were rules, sometimes, no theft, no violence, but enforcement was sporadic. The owners might hire a watchman, or rely on threats alone. The fear of being turned out into the cold again was enough to keep many quiet. And yet for all this, the Doss house offered something the street could not. A chance, however slim, at rest. A place where the cold was dulled, if not absent. Where bodies, however cramped, could be still. Where the elements were kept at bay by cracked plaster and leaky roofs. For some, that was enough. The Doss houses grew as the century wore on. More mouths without homes meant more pennies to be scraped from the margins. Some houses catered to women, though they were fewer and rougher in rule. Mothers clutched their infants close, not only for warmth, but for fear of what the night might bring. Others kept to themselves, avoiding even eye contact, as if to be seen too clearly was to risk something irretrievable. There were, of course, better lodging houses. Clean, regulated, respectable, but these were for the deserving poor, the clerks fallen on hard times, the widows of modest means. For those without names or pasts, without papers or letters of recommendation, there were only the places where payment was taken in copper and counted out by lamplight before entry was allowed. And so sleep remained a transaction, measured in pennies and discomfort. The poorest walked past the Doss houses and watched their lights glow faintly behind drawn curtains. The middle poor queued at the door, coins clutched in calloused hands, and within, beneath the wooden beams and soot-black walls, another night passed, not in rest, but in endurance. The rope would be cut at dawn, the boxes emptied, the benches cleared, and those who had sat or slumped or curled themselves into those spaces would rise again, stiff and unspoken, blinking against the pale city light as the morning fog began to drift once more into the streets. As the grey morning settled back across the city, and bodies emerged slowly from beneath benches, boxes and slumping ropes, the air remained thick with something beyond fog. It was not smoke, though smoke lingered always, nor was it the miasma of hunger or sweat. It was awareness. a subtle alertness that clung to those who walked the edge of the visible world, a sense that someone might be watching, that one might be asked to move along, that a quiet morning might become something else entirely, with little cause and no warning. Among the many dangers of homelessness in Victorian London, the cold, the hunger, the sickness, there was also the figure of the watchman, a man in uniform, a parish constable, a keeper of public order. To the housed, he was reassurance; to the unhoused, he was uncertainty. Never quite a rescuer, rarely a punisher, often simply an obstacle that one could neither avoid nor trust. London's constabulary in the mid-19th century was still evolving. The Metropolitan Police, founded in 1829 under Sir Robert Peel, was not yet the deeply bureaucratic force it would later become. It was still learning how to manage a city that outgrew itself every year. Yet its blue-coated officers, known as bobbies or peelers, had become fixtures on the streets, especially in districts where wealth met poverty, and the poor were most visible to those who wished not to see them. The role of the police was not in practice to care for the homeless, it was to keep order, and order, in the eyes of the city, meant cleanliness, stillness, predictability. A man sleeping in a doorway disturbed that vision. A group huddled under a market awning threatened the illusion of stability. A woman sitting too long beneath a lamp-post might draw the wrong sort of gaze, and so the watchman's task, more often than not, was to disperse, quietly when possible, with force if required. To those on the streets, the rhythms of policing were familiar. Some officers moved through their patrols with a kind of resigned routine. They would tap a booted foot near a slumbering figure, wait for a groan or movement, and continue on. Others were less gentle, more eager to assert their presence, dragging, shouting, or threatening with the sharp end of a truncheon. Violence was not the norm, but it was not rare either. There were few witnesses, fewer complaints, and even less consequence. There were laws, of course. The Vagrancy Acts of 1824 and later years gave police broad authority to arrest those found wandering abroad, sleeping in the open air, or not giving a good account of themselves. But the law was often a tool of convenience rather than justice. A man arrested for loitering one day might be ignored the next, depending on who was watching or who had complained. A woman might be taken in not for any crime, but because her presence displeased a shopkeeper or interrupted the symmetry of a well-swept square. Arrest was not always violent. Sometimes it was as quiet as a hand on the arm, a word murmured near the ear, a gentle guiding away from the street into the shadow of the station house. But the consequences were rarely mild. A night in the cells was a night without pennies, without food, and without the fragile shelter of a doss. It might mean a court appearance, a fine impossible to pay, or a mark against one's name, not that many names were known. Still, there were some who chose arrest over the alternative. A cell was warmer than the street. A crust of bread given in custody was better than nothing. For a few, prison became a cycle, a brief reprieve from exposure, then return, then arrest again. It was a system without kindness, but with a certain brutal predictability. The streets had no such rhythm. Parish authorities, too, played their part. Overseers of the poor, remnants of older, church-based systems of charity, were tasked with deciding who might be granted relief and who was to be turned away. Their offices were often cold and bureaucratic, thick with forms and questions. One needed proof of residence, proof of identity, a history that could be tracked. For the homeless, who had neither address nor documentation, such proof was impossible. Without it, the parish offered little, sometimes a referral to the workhouse, sometimes nothing at all. Children caught wandering alone were often scooped up and delivered to institutions. Protection, it was called. But the walls of orphanages and industrial schools were not soft, and their discipline was as much about punishment as it was about instruction. A boy who stole a crust might find himself locked away for months. A girl taken in for begging could be placed in service without choice. The city's broader mechanisms, its charities, its missions, its soup kitchens, operated adjacent to the state, often motivated by religion or reformist zeal. They too were watched by officials, but loosely, and they too judged who was deserving, and who was not. To be homeless in Victorian London was therefore to live under constant low-grade surveillance, not the modern surveillance of cameras and records, but the older kind, the watching eyes of men with keys and sticks, who might ask a question, demand a name, or simply decide that one no longer belonged in a given space. There was little protection to be found in their presence, and less sympathy. Their duty was to the city's image, its smooth surfaces, its quiet streets, its unbroken order, and so the homeless learned to move without being noticed, to sleep in shadows rather than light, to leave no trace, speak no word, give no reason for inquiry. They became ghosts in a city that claimed to value civilization. Their fear was not only of hunger or cold, it was of being seen too clearly, of being recorded, marked, swept away. The watchman would continue his circuit. The constable would record his steps in a ledger. The city would breathe again, briefly satisfied that it remained intact. But beneath that breath, and beneath that gaze, the street people of London would shift again, to quieter corners, darker alleys, places where even the watchman's boots did not echo. There was, beyond the eyes of the constable and the unspoken threats of the street, a larger building that seemed to watch the city in turn, not with the cold interest of a policeman, but with something deeper, something ancient. The workhouse. It stood in every parish, stone-heavy and dull, a silhouette of order and discipline, and though its gates were open in theory, to cross that threshold was not simply to step into shelter, it was to surrender something quieter, but more essential, one's personhood, one's pace, one's place in the story of the city. Most Londoners knew where the nearest workhouse stood. Its walls loomed near market roads, behind churches, or not far from the sounds of industry. Built in a square or block, they followed a shared architecture, simple, functional, without adornment. Iron gates, rows of windows, narrow walkways between sleeping wards and washhouses. The chimneys smoked, but slowly, never cheerfully. The air around them held a different kind of fog, as if even the coal here burned under rules. The idea of the workhouse had begun with the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, a moment in British policy that shifted responsibility from local kindness to state-enforced discipline. Poverty was no longer seen as a misfortune to be relieved, but a condition to be managed, a symptom of moral failure, best corrected through hardship. The workhouse would feed, clothe, and house the destitute, but never in comfort, never in kindness. Its role was not to help, but to deter. To enter the workhouse, one first had to be broken, whether by hunger, illness, cold, or the simple erosion of days with no coin and no corner left to sleep in. It was not a choice made lightly. For many it came only after nights too many to count, or a winter that would not end. And even then, it was a threshold approached with shame. Those who stepped toward its gates often did so silently, without announcement, without pride, a quiet surrender to the city's final offer. Inside, the routines were strict. Entry meant the division of families, husbands from wives, mothers from sons, daughters into the care of matrons, boys under the eye of wardmasters. The loss of identity began at the door, names replaced by numbers, clothes stripped and replaced with uniforms of rough, identical cloth. Every hour was regimented. Meals, work, silence, sleep. The day was broken not by freedom, but by the bell. The food was just enough, thin broths, coarse bread, sometimes porridge. It was nutrition by calculation, designed not to satisfy, but to sustain. The taste, if one paused long enough to consider it, was bland, the smell faintly sour, as if even the pots resented their use. The dining rooms echoed with the clatter of tin spoons, but no conversation. Silence was expected, gratitude was assumed. Work filled the daylight hours. Men broke stones, picked oakum, or labored in the laundry. Women sewed, scrubbed, or peeled vegetables in long repetitive lines. Children were sometimes sent to industrial schools, sometimes kept within, set to small tasks that mimicked the labor of their elders. The work was not meaningful, nor productive. It was a moral weight, a lesson, repeated endlessly, that poverty had a price, and no one entered free of charge. The air within the workhouse carried its own smell, a mix of wet stone, boiled starch, old metal, and worn bodies. It was neither offensive nor pleasant, simply ever-present, like the ticking of a clock in a room with no exit. Windows were often fogged, the corners damp, but always swept. Cleanliness was enforced, not as a kindness, but as a rule. Dirt belonged to the street. Inside these walls, dirt was punished. Foulness was common. Despite the attempts at order, bodies weakened by years of outdoor life often failed to rally. The infirmary was sparse, beds close, staff minimal, medicines were rudimentary. Those who fell ill often lingered quietly, separated from the main body, their absence barely noted. There were deaths, of course, but they passed without ceremony. A burial at parish expense, a name inked in a register, if known, nothing more. And yet, despite the coldness, the regimentation, the quiet cruelty of its structure, the workhouse endured. It was not kindness that kept people inside, but exhaustion. A man with no boots left to wear might accept the uniform if only to warm his feet. A mother with a coughing child might trade her freedom for a shared wall and a bowl of broth. For some it became a kind of rhythm. For others, a final place, the last door closed before the world ended altogether. But even within the walls, most dreamed of leaving, not to a better life, but to the street, to the smoke, the markets, the hum of life however hard. The workhouse, though it offered shelter, stripped the self. Outside, one might be ragged and nameless, but free. Inside, one was part of a system, watched always, ruled by the bell and the gate. Thus it stood in every district, a silent presence, the shadow behind the church, the building seen from the bridge, the place avoided if possible. It was spoken of in low tones, its name invoked as a threat, a warning. "You'll end up in the workhouse," they said, and they meant it not as hope, but as condemnation. The city, for all its industrial might and imperial pride, never built anything grander to house its poorest. The workhouse was its answer, its compromise. It looked no different at dusk than at dawn. Its doors closed with a slow finality, and even those who had never passed its gate felt its breath on their necks as they walked the narrow alleys of survival. The watchman passed, the gaslights hummed, and the street outside remained a place of cold mercy. But now and then, a figure might glance toward the great square shape in the distance, not with longing, not quite with dread, but with that quiet wordless knowing that this was what awaited if all else failed. In the soft churn of the city's lower rhythms, among soot-blackened bricks and the smell of yesterday's broth, there were other shapes, smaller, quicker, quieter. They moved without the weight of age, but carried burdens that pressed more heavily than their size would suggest. Children, hundreds, thousands, uncounted, unnoticed. They passed through the alleys like wind beneath doorframes, mud on their fingers, dust in their hair, their presence felt but rarely held. The city called them many names: street Arabs, gutter snipes, the invisible army of London, names given by writers, reformers, and constables. But they had few names for themselves. They had routines instead, territories, and unspoken rules. Each morning, like shadows spilling over the rooftops, they dispersed, from makeshift camps beneath bridges, stairwells, or the overhangs of stables. They slipped into the waking city, not to school, not to safety, but to the long, slow industry of surviving childhood, without a home. The workhouse had beds for some of them, narrow, numbered, watched by nurses or ward matrons, who measured order by silence and obedience. But many children evaded such walls, unwilling to trade the erratic freedom of the street for the uniform hunger of the institution. Some had fled from cruelty inside the workhouses, some had been born in the alleys, others simply disappeared from parish rolls after a parent's death, or abandonment, or the kind of loss that London did not record. They found employment of a kind, not the formal hiring of paper and wage, but the small, bitter trades left open to the ragged. Boys gathered at crossings with brooms, offering to sweep the wet mud aside for a coin. Their feet were bare more often than not, their trousers too short, jackets too large, The older ones taught the younger when to ask, when to vanish, which faces might give a penny and which might give a blow. They knew how to run without looking behind them, how to sleep without snoring, how to pretend they didn't feel the cold. Girls too sold things, matches, flowers, sometimes water in tin pails. They sang, not from joy but from routine, their voices high and thin beneath the heavy growl of wagons and market bells. In winter, their hands cracked. In summer, their souls burned on the cobbles. They aged quickly, not in years, but in posture, in voice, in the set of the mouth, when someone looked at them too long. And there were pickpockets. Some worked in groups, others alone. The art was not in theft, but in invisibility, becoming part of the wallpaper of the city until one's fingers slipped into a coat or purse as easily as wind rustles cloth. When caught, they were punished with a harshness reserved for their poverty, not their crime. But most were not caught. Most were simply absorbed back into the noise, the smell, the slow movement of London's unrecorded hours. They lived in corners, not just physical, but social, behind crates in markets, beneath carts in stable yards, in the hollows of half-built houses or the cracks beneath stairs. They curled together in twos or threes for warmth, their conversations short, shaped by necessity. They spoke of food, of places not to go, of constables' names. They shared everything except the future, which none of them could see clearly. Their sicknesses were not different from adults, only faster. Coughs that turned deep, sores that never closed, eyes swollen from smoke or sleep deprivation. No one took their temperatures, no one asked their pain. They bore it as they bore everything, silently, with shoulders curled inward and hands buried in pockets. Sometimes a child vanished from a usual spot. No announcement followed. Perhaps they had moved on, perhaps they hadn't. Victorian London, for all its scientific lectures and moralizing pamphlets, rarely offered more than fleeting notice. Philanthropists wrote about them, called them waifs, lost lambs, orphans in need of Christian guidance. They published accounts of transformation, the boy made into a clerk, the girl trained in laundry work. But most children were not transformed. They were simply used, as labor, as cautionary tales, or as silence itself. When the fog came down thickest, they disappeared entirely, muffled by smoke and forgotten by those who passed in carriages just a few feet away. The gas lamps lit nothing beneath a certain height. The children's world lived just below the glow, just beyond the record, and so they moved, not toward adulthood, but through it in miniature, shortened lives, unmarked graves, their fingerprints on the edge of every building, their breath in the soot of stairwells. If the city had a memory, it rarely called their names. If it had a conscience, it was too busy measuring coal and counting coins to hear the soft footsteps of those who walked uninvited through its broken streets. By dawn, they would be at it again, sweeping crossings, lifting lids on bins, watching boots for signs of wealth or weakness. They would not grow old with pensions or headstones. Their legacy was in their absence. Mud on the edge of a gutter, a name chalked on a wall, then washed away by rain. They lived, not loudly, but certainly, and then they were gone. She was one of many, though her presence never made itself known loudly. No one remembered the moment she had first begun sleeping beneath the wooden archway behind the ironmonger's yard. She had simply been there, quiet, consistent, unobtrusive, a shape in the mornings, a shadow by dusk, wrapped always in the same threadbare shawl of greying wool, stained from years of rain, and soot, and time. Her face was lined but not fierce. It had the gentleness of someone long resigned to a world that no longer held room for her. Widowhood, in the world beyond the soot and broken paving stones, carried with it customs, black crepe veils, visits from clergy, tea poured in drawing rooms thick with sympathy. But among the pavements and cellars of London's east and south banks, widowhood simply meant the sudden presence of one less voice, one fewer wage, one more mouth to feed, until it no longer could be fed at all. She had had a home once, a small room, shared with her husband, somewhere off Bethnal Green Road. The memory of it still lived faintly in the way she folded her blanket in the morning, smoothed her skirt at the knees, kept her boots close to her body as she slept. But the home was long gone. The rent had outlasted the earnings, and he, the man who had fetched coal and brought back turnips wrapped in old newspaper, had died in the bitter spring of '57, coughing blood into a handkerchief they couldn't afford to launder. She might have turned to the parish. Many did. But pride was a thing slow to abandon, even when the stomach had. She stayed out of the workhouse, just took to the street, not as a vagrant in sudden ruin, but as someone who had gradually run out of rooms, of roofs, of rights. She adapted slowly, with the careful logic of a woman who had once kept a ledger for her husband's grocer's stall. She knew how to stretch a halfpenny, knew where the bakers dumped their unsold loaves, which alley behind the butcher's shop gave off warmth from the wall oven long after the shutters came down. She did not beg, not often. Instead, she moved from place to place with the subtlety of someone unused to being noticed. A basket over her arm, her back hunched slightly, not from pain, but as if to take up less space. The street knew her without knowing her name. Shop boys might nod. Other women, the ones who sold matchsticks near the tram lines, or scrubbed floors in the railway stations, sometimes shared a glance with her, a crust, a wordless understanding. London was not a city built for single women without means. Its alleys offered no shelter, only corners. Its people offered no certainty, only passing eyes. At night, the threat of violence curled tightly through the air, quieter than the threat of cold but heavier, more pressing. She slept with her boots on, kept a flat stone wrapped in cloth by her side, not as a weapon, but as a weight, something to grip if startled, something solid in a world made mostly of uncertainty. When it rained, she moved slowly, careful of her footing on the slick cobbles. The old wound on her ankle, from a factory accident in her younger years, grew stiff in the cold. She spoke to no one of it, just rubbed it now and again beneath her skirt, eyes blinking through the drizzle. Her shawl smelled faintly of smoke and starch. She folded it with care every morning, as if still laying it across a bed that no longer existed. Other women joined her sometimes, not close, but nearby, a silent congregation of the forgotten. Some younger, some older, many sick, few loud. They shared nothing but space, and even that only when forced. The city pushed them together like driftwood against a bank, but never long enough to root. A glance here, a cough there, sometimes a shared biscuit, then they scattered again by daybreak, each to her own survival. She was not unique, she was not rare, but neither was she unimportant. Her life, like the lives of hundreds of homeless women in London's industrial heart, was built not on catastrophe, but on the slow, steady erosion of belonging. One illness, one lost job, one man's death, one more door closed, and then the street, indifferent, unyielding, always waiting. There were charities, missions, shelters with hard benches and harder rules. She used them when she had to, but they did not feel safe. Not in the way a certain stairwell behind the bakery did, or a walled corner in the back garden of a long-abandoned school. Those spaces had their own language, their own rhythms. She had learned them by living them, not by being instructed. And through it all, she maintained something very small, but deeply human, dignity. It showed in the way she kept her hands clean, when water could be found, in how she refused to curse the passers-by who ignored her, in how she still straightened her back when rising, even if no one was watching. London did not record her name. She never appeared in court rolls or census returns. Her story wasn't printed in pamphlets or etched in stone, but her footsteps wore the curb edges smooth. Her breath clouded the morning air beneath the same lampposts. Each dawn, her silence spoke volumes about the world that allowed her to drift unseen. She was the widow in grey wool, one of many, yet singular. She was a thread in the endless weave of soot, stone and sorrow that made up the fabric of the Victorian city. And as the winter deepened and the nights grew longer, she endured, not loudly, not boldly, but completely. Sunday came not with ceremony, but with a gentler hush that fell over the city like mist. The morning opened slowly. There were no factory whistles, no carts clattering with milk churns, no foreman barking from behind warehouse gates. Instead, there was the tolling of bells, deep, rolling tones from steeples old and soot-blackened, calling out across the rooftops like slow breathing. The sound echoed through the fog, bouncing off chimneys and slipping between alleyways, brushing even the lowest corners of the city where no invitation had been extended. In the quiet of the Sabbath, the divisions of London became more pronounced, not less. The work had ceased, but the gaps between the classes had not. On this day of supposed rest, those with shelter emerged washed and dressed, buttoned and brushed, gloved and glancing politely at the pavements as they passed. They moved toward churches with doors wide open and stained glass flickering in the muted sun. The smell of starch and lavender clung faintly to their coats. On the steps outside, sat motionless were others, the ones not going in. They sat along the railings, slumped in doorways, half woken by the bells but with nowhere to walk, no pew to claim, no warm bench to rest upon. Their Sunday was not one of hymns or liturgy, but of waiting, waiting for the day to pass, waiting for warmth to return, waiting mostly for Monday, when the world would resume and perhaps there might be something, a crust, a coin, a corner not yet claimed. Children curled like cats in the recesses of courtyards, their eyes flickering shut again beneath the still rising sun. Elderly men sat with knees drawn up, hands in sleeves, heads bowed not in reverence, but from the ache of standing too long the day before. And women, many alone, some with others, remained tucked into door frames, their eyes following the movement of well-fed families in silk-trimmed coats, as if watching a procession they once walked in themselves. Church bells marked each quarter hour, and with every ring came a deeper silence in the streets beyond the sanctuaries. The sermons echoed behind wooden doors, but the words didn't reach the outer curbs, where coal soot still clung to the railings, and the cobbles remained blackened from Saturday's labour. In the richer districts, Sunday morning brought the gentle rustle of newspapers, the light clatter of teacups on trays, the swish of skirts over polished floors. The poorer districts, where the homeless settled like sediment at the bottom of a long week, experienced no such softness. The Sabbath was colder here, lonelier. It reminded the body of every bruise and every missing layer of cloth. Some charity chapels opened their doors for bread and weak tea, offered with gloved hands and distant smiles. But even these gestures, kind though they might be, came with rules. Prayers first, silence next, seating last. Many of the street sleepers could not last through it, knees too sore to kneel, ears too tired to listen, so they lingered instead at the edges, behind fence posts, beside coal cellars, leaning against stone steps that warmed just a little in the morning light. Sunday was not a reprieve, only a pause. Even the noises of the city changed. Without the market wagons, without the blacksmiths ringing hammers, London settled into a softer rhythm. Distant voices carried further, a dog's bark felt louder. The sound of church choirs, warbling, high and clear, hovered faintly in the distance, like the cry of birds over a silent field. The homeless did not join in the singing. Their mouths were too dry, their throats too sore, but they heard the music, just barely, as they shifted on stone steps or pressed backs against sun-warmed bricks. Some closed their eyes, some didn't bother, others simply stared, unspeaking, at the lines of polished shoes entering one sanctuary after another. The city, for all its architecture and might, had little room for them on Sunday mornings. Doorways were claimed early, the workhouse gates were shut, soup kitchens opened late, and for the long hours in between, there was simply waiting, watching, enduring. Those who passed them, parishioners, clergymen, even constables, sometimes offered a glance. A few gave coins, slipped quickly from coat pockets with the practiced air of someone doing a duty, rather than extending a kindness. Others offered tracts, religious handbills printed in batches, and handed out with detached cheer, quoting scripture above the curled bodies of those who had not eaten since Friday. The city's hunger did not rest on Sundays, neither did its cold, but its movement did, and so time stretched wider, slower, and more unforgiving. A day meant to be holy became a day that reminded the poor of how far they stood outside the circles of warmth and routine. Some of the homeless, if strength allowed, walked to the edges of the city, not out of hope, but in search of quiet. The fields beyond Bethnal Green, the towpaths near Wapping, or the broken orchards behind old hospitals, offered space without questions. They would rest there, in silence, under bare branches, or beside canal walls slick with moss. The bells were quieter there, the judgments fewer. The sun, if it came at all, reached the skin without interruption. But most remained close to the stone and brick of the inner city, close to the fire they could never enter, to the prayers they could never fully speak, to the bread they would only taste if the sermons ended early and the charitable spirit lasted long enough. Sunday passed not with drama, but with distance. The bells tolled again at noon. Doors opened, worshippers emerged, blinking in the late morning light. The rich returned to roasts and puddings. The shop shutters remained closed, and the poor, those who had not moved all morning, slowly unfolded themselves from corners, rubbing limbs back to life, standing stiffly on aching feet. By dusk, the city would stir again. The bells would stop, the chill would return, and Monday would bring the usual noise, the usual movement, the usual indifference. But for now, for these hours, Sunday lived in silence, and so did they. Time passed not in dates or calendars, but in the smells of the city. Spring arrived first in the gutters, long before it touched the trees. The frost lifted reluctantly from the cobblestones, revealing the damp scars of the months before, the soaked rags left in drains, the swollen carcasses of rats, the blackened cores of rotted potatoes crushed under carriage wheels. The air warmed just enough to stir them back to life, and with warmth came scent. It was not the smell of blossom, not yet. Not in the places where the homeless wandered. It was the smell of rot giving way to growth. The sour, milky edge of fermentation in alley puddles, the sharp stolness of decaying bread, left behind taverns, the faint vinegar tang rising from slop carts being dragged once more through the markets. Spring made the city breathe again, but what it exhaled was old and unkind. In the wealthier lanes, magnolia and lavender began to stretch cautiously over garden fences, but further downwind, where the soot stuck longer to the bricks and the sun arrived half an hour late, spring was marked instead by the loosening of the earth beneath one's feet. The ground turned to clay, soft and thick, and soaked the hems of skirts and trousers alike. Boots squelched in alleyways that hadn't dried since November. The chill receded, but the cold didn't. Not truly. It lingered in the marrow of those who had spent the winter sleeping against stone, and for many, the early days of spring brought not relief, but colds, chest aches, and hacking coughs that sounded like broken grates being shaken in the dark. Summer followed, not with celebration, but with steam. The homeless came to fear it as much as they had feared frost. It made the city sweat, not just its people, but its buildings, its soil, its breath. The Thames thickened under the sun, and its banks released a stench that crept through the boroughs like invisible smoke. The mudflats exposed at low tide bubbled softly, dotted with things that should have been buried or burned. Boots, bones, barrels, offal from slaughterhouses. Their edges shimmered with flies. In these months, the homeless moved slower, their bodies too dried out to manage the long trudges between charity lines or market scraps. They slept more during the day, slumped in the shadows of bridge arches or curled behind crates in the shade of warehouses. The sun turned the rooftops to griddles, and the air beneath to soup. Sweat gathered behind knees and underarms, soaking worn wool that hadn't been laundered since the workhouse or ever. There were days when even the constables seemed less inclined to move them on. Too hot, too thick, too many other matters. Cholera returned in years like that, quietly at first in the poorer courts, then with fanfare, when the dead began appearing in doorways and outside the lodging houses. The smell of lime followed, sprinkled in haste over bodies and cesspits alike. When autumn returned, it came without colour in these parts of London. The leaves fell, yes, mostly from the soot-black trees in back gardens or along the canal, but they landed in sludge, not in golden piles. The rain returned with earnest. The ground turned slick. The smoke from chimneys thickened as people burned anything they could find. Coal, yes, but also paper, rope, splinters of discarded furniture. The smell became a heavy weight in the lungs. Smoke mixed with mildew, dung, and roast meat that none of the street sleepers would ever taste. This was the season of sore joints, of persistent damp, of leather boots that never dried. It was the time of wind that whistled through broken windows and turned alleyways into flutes. For the homeless, it was the beginning of reckoning, a decision once again about how, or whether, to survive the next few months. And then winter returned, always crueler than the year before. It was not just the cold that hurt, but the way it magnified everything else. Every bone bruise, every cough, every missed meal. The air turned metallic, the cobblestones froze, and breath steamed from mouths like smoke from chimneys. The city muffled itself under frost, and in the quiet, one could hear things normally hidden by noise: the drip of leaking roofs, the brittle snap of ice forming in gutters, the thin scratching of rats beneath floorboards. Snow, when it came, was not the soft kind. It was grey before it reached the ground, poisoned by chimney soot and factory fumes. It melted into grime almost immediately, pooling in corners and freezing overnight into treacherous panes of ice. The homeless learned to sleep sitting up, pressed into walls that still retained the memory of a day's warmth. Some wrapped newspapers around their limbs, others tried to dig nests from sacks and straw, but straw was rare in the city, claimed quickly for animal beds and stable floors. Death came more quietly in winter. A figure still one night might simply remain still the next morning. Constables, when they came, did not rush. The body was removed gently, without panic. There were no records, no names, just an entry in a workhouse register, or none at all. Each season carved itself into the bodies of the homeless in different ways. Spring brought sickness, summer brought exhaustion, autumn bruises and damp, and winter, if they lived through it, brought a silence that stayed in the bones long after the thaw. But all seasons shared one thing: smell. The city exhaled through its waste, through its damp stones, its crowded tenements, its steaming drains, its overworked horses, its buried refuse. There was always something rising, a fog, a reek, a breath too full of the past to be ignored. The rich burned candles to cover it, the poor grew used to it, the homeless breathed it in, day after day, without choice or complaint. It was the background music to their lives, the scent of time passing without notice, the odor of an empire rotting from the ground up. And so the city turned, day after day, beneath its layered smoke and steam. The homeless, like shadows caught in the tide, were drawn not only by instinct or desperation, but by memory, the invisible paths they walked each morning, the corners that held bread, the fences behind which warmth could sometimes be found. But above all, there were the doors. The iron gates of London's charitable institutions stood not so much as symbols of mercy, but as quiet arbiters of who might eat that day and who might not. They came in many forms: shelters, missions, soup kitchens, temperance halls, reform homes, ragged schools, scattered throughout the city like islands of conditional relief. And every morning, long before dawn pierced the fog, hands reached for those gates. Gloved hands, bare hands, hands wrapped in old rags or torn socks, hands that trembled from cold or hunger, or the shaking fatigue of another sleepless night. Some of these gates never opened until midday, others, rarely at all, but still they were waited on. It was not simply food that lay behind them, or shelter. It was structure, however fragile. A bowl of broth meant another day endured. A bed inside a mission meant a night free from the rain and the taunts of the passing drunk. Even if the sermons were long and the rules strict, even if the bread was dry and the stew thin, there was comfort in knowing that something, somewhere, was warm and open. The shelters varied in purpose and philosophy. Some were run by religious orders: Baptist, Methodist, Anglican, each with its own expectations of the body and the soul. Others were civic ventures, formed by committees of well-meaning Victorians who sought to uplift the deserving poor. They were marked by plaques, blackened by soot but legible in daylight: refuge for the destitute, the asylum for the houseless poor, mission to the fallen women, night refuge for men. Most did not advertise food, only a chance to rest, or listen, or wash. The rituals began before one crossed the threshold. First, the wait. Lines formed along the walls, curving around corners and clustering beneath overhangs for shelter from the drizzle. Men in threadbare coats, women clutching children, boys with soot-smudged faces, all in quiet procession, eyes forward, no words wasted. There was no noise except for the distant clatter of carts, the drip of water from broken pipes, the muffled coughs that rose like tired birds from the line. In winter, breath steamed in great clouds above the waiting. In summer, sweat slicked brows and made shirt collars cling to skin. But the line held, day after day, season after season. When the gates did open, it was often without ceremony. A matron, a constable, a mission worker with wire-rimmed glasses and stiff posture, a nod, a slow motion inward. No one pushed. To lose one's place was to risk losing everything. Behind the gate, the first stop was usually inspection. Men and boys were separated from women and girls. They were searched, sometimes questioned, hands scrubbed, hair checked, boots, if still worn, examined for lice. The idea was to prevent contamination, of disease, yes, but also of spirit. Dirt, in the Victorian mind, was not merely unsanitary, it was moral. It meant neglect, weakness, failure. Before soup was ladled or blankets handed out, the poor were reminded that cleanliness came first, in skin, speech and thoughts. Inside, the lighting was dim, often from gas lamps flickering against walls long stained with smoke. The floors were stone or worn wood, windows high and barred. A mission hall might have benches and a pulpit, a shelter, rows of cots or wooden boxes with hay. The air was heavy with lye, unwashed clothes, and the faint sweetness of boiled grains. Before meals, there were prayers. Long ones, delivered in voices that echoed in the rafters. The homeless bowed their heads not always in reverence, but in exhaustion. They heard words of redemption, of turning away from sin, of God's mercy upon the humble. They heard hymns sung in cracked harmony. They listened to readings of parables and sermons against drink, vice and idleness. In return for warmth, they sat still. Then came the meal. If it was a place that offered one, ladled into tin bowls, served with hunks of bread already hardening at the crust. Gruel, sometimes, weak tea, a few slivers of potato, or beans or cabbage boiled into translucence. Not enough to feel full, but enough to quiet the ache, to still the hands, to slow the mind long enough for one's heartbeat to soften. They ate silently. Voices were discouraged. Gratitude was expected. Not everyone made it in. Numbers were limited. Some turned away after hours of waiting. Others refused to go at all, proud, wary, unwilling to submit to inspection or prayer. They waited outside, pressing their hands against the iron, listening to the scrape of spoons and the murmur of scripture within. The reform homes, especially for women and girls, were more rigid still. They required commitment, days, weeks, months of adherence to routine. Rise at dawn, wash, prayers, chores, mending, more prayers, silent meals, early lights out. They were not shelters, but institutions, places for reform, not rest. Girls caught selling matches on street corners might be brought in, washed, dressed in plain grey gowns, and taught to sew. Some never left. Others slipped away in the night, back to the only streets they had known. Charity missions walked a delicate line. They were both sanctuary and judgment. The iron gates could offer warmth, but they could also close. The poor knew this. Their hands reached, not always in hope, but in habit. They did not ask for kindness. They asked for access, for one more chance to sit, to eat, to breathe without shivering. Outside, when night returned, the gates were locked again. The queue dissolved back into the alleys and undercrofts, back to wagons and stairwells and benches with ropes strung across them. But the gates remained, looming, inert, iron strong, a symbol perhaps of both the mercy and the failure of a city too vast to care for all its own. And in the morning, the hands would return. Night in London deepened not all at once. but in layers, shadows pooled at the base of walls and chimneys, draped slowly over steps and doorways, before rising to the eaves and fogging out the last hints of sun. Street by street, block by block, the city was tucked into darkness, except where gaslights held their soft stuttering vigil, and from there, deeper within, came a second kind of glow. Behind glass panes, fires flickered in hearths. Yellow-orange light warmed the walls of front parlours and drawing rooms, casting long shadows of teacups and fringed lamps across thick carpets. From the outside, through narrow gaps in curtains or across iron railings, the scenes unfolded quietly, never for the viewer, only observed in passing, never belonging. The homeless of Victorian London, those who walked without destination or crouched beneath arches to escape the mist, rarely looked up for long. But sometimes, on nights especially sharp with frost or hunger, the eye was drawn, unbidden, to a glow that meant something very different to those inside. A chair pulled close to the fire, a child curled on a rug, reading a penny serial, a servant setting down a tray, shadows of idle comfort moving slowly across warm-lit walls. There was no place for envy. Hunger leaves little room for such luxury, but still the contrast was felt, not always in thoughts, but in the slow ache of distance. Warmth was not simply a matter of coal and brick. It was placement, status, belonging. Inside the homes of clerks and clerics, of widows with annuities and gentlemen with stable incomes, warmth was ordinary. It filled rooms without effort, seeping from hot bricks and steaming kettles, from thick velvet curtains drawn tight against the cold. Outside, there was only the wind, sharp between buildings, snagging at rags and sleeves, creeping into the lungs like a slow drowning. Chimneys exhaled in soft grey plumes above rooftops, while those below huddled behind crates, or against the walls of churches whose windows glowed with candlelight and choral echo. The fire was everywhere, and nowhere reachable. London's homes, even modest ones, wore their comfort proudly. Lace at the windows, a polished bell pull, a spill of yellow from a door briefly opened, to let a guest in, or a servant out. Inside, the world moved on schedules. Supper at 7, parlour music by 8:30, fires banked before bed. The quiet domestic rituals that required only stability to maintain. Everything was upholstered, softened, enclosed. The drawing room, in particular, stood as a kind of altar to domestic peace. Paintings in frames, ferns in porcelain pots, upholstered chairs with antimacassars, and needlepoint cushions. Books stacked neatly, their spines unbroken. Tea services in shining tin, and always the hearth, not simply for heat, but for gathering, for presence. The fire was conversation, warmth, and containment. And yet, for the homeless passing by, heads bowed, shoulders hunched, it was a dream so distant it no longer stung. On winter evenings, when windows frosted at the edges and ice set hard in the gutters, the light inside became sharper, more golden. It spilled across the panes in a soft, almost liquid shape, catching on curtains and brass knobs, turning every domestic scene into a small painting. And then the view was gone. A curtain drawn, a candle snuffed, a door closed. The homeless turned their faces from the fire, not because they wished to, but because they had to. The fire was not for them. To linger too long was to draw attention, to risk being moved along by a constable or barked at by a servant. The city knew its boundaries well. Light belonged to interiors, shadows to the street. In the wealthier quarters, Belgravia, Mayfair, Kensington, it was not only warmth that marked the divide. It was scent, roast meats, fresh-baked puddings, wax polish, lavender water. These smells slipped into the cold air through cracked windows and open fanlights, mingling with the scent of the Thames and chimney soot. The contrast was dizzying. One breath spoke of fullness, the next of decay. For women without shelter, the sight of drawing rooms was especially sharp. Inside they might see dresses laid out for evening wear, hair being arranged before a mirror, gloves being buttoned for a night at the theatre. Outside, their own clothes clung in damp folds, stiff with dirt and old soap, hands chapped, feet blistered. The difference between lives was not simply economic. It was atmospheric. Each interior held a kind of certainty that no alley or rope bed could offer. Some of the poor, especially children, would peer briefly into these windows before vanishing again into the maze of the city. Not in mischief, not in hope, just in passing. A glance, a breath, and then gone. The night had too many demands for lingering. For the middle-class Victorians within, the poor were both invisible and ever-present. They moved beyond the window like fog, sometimes visible, often not, always uninvited. Their presence was felt in the double-bolted doors, in the coal deliveries arriving early to warm the front hall before guests arrived, in the quiet unease that followed a knocked window pane or a face glimpsed just beyond the gate. Charitable impulses existed. Yes, missions were funded, pennies were spared, clothes were donated, but the fire was never shared. It remained enclosed, symbolic, an emblem of separation. Warmth meant safety, privacy, security. Outside, the city breathed cold against brick and glass, and still the homeless moved, walked, or curled silently in their corners. They did not look long through the windows. They did not press too close. They knew the rules. The fire was not for them, so they turned their faces away. By the middle of the 19th century, London's streets had already become a subject of study, commentary, and moral concern, not because they had changed, but because eyes had finally turned to them. The men and women who slept on the stones and scavenged by the riverbanks had long been there, moving quietly between the cracks of wealth and neglect. But now, their presence began to leave a faint mark, not in the places they lived, but in the places they were written about. It started with ink, thin, fading letters pressed onto thick, fibrous paper, sold for a penny a sheet. In the reading rooms of philanthropic societies and the offices of reformist gentlemen, the homeless became objects of inquiry. A census here, a report there. Columns in the Illustrated London News, observations from the Poor Law Commissioners, printed pity. The language was always careful, never personal. The vagrant class, the destitute poor, the residuum. Words that placed bodies into categories, that wrapped complex human stories in neat, administrative terms. Writers described them as a problem to be solved, a symptom to be studied. The homeless were counted by parish, gender, and age, reduced to lists, ratios, and columns of figures arranged in tables, cold numbers to represent warm bodies. Yet these documents, dry as they often were, held glimmers of truth. Hidden within the reports of the Society for the Suppression of Mendicity, one could find not just condemnation but confusion. Officials puzzled over why people continued to sleep in the open when the workhouse offered a roof. Reformers debated whether to attribute homelessness to drink, misfortune, or moral failing. Clergy argued for salvation. Doctors noted the physical decline, and in each report, between the lines, there lingered a slow dawning realization that the city itself produced the poor it pitied. Newspapers were less clinical, but no less detached. Editors of the Times and the Morning Chronicle occasionally sent writers into the East End, not to live among the poor, but to observe, record, and retreat. Their articles appeared in serialized columns, often in winter, when compassion rose with the frost. One week might detail a woman who'd given birth in a stable, the next a man found frozen beneath an arch. These vignettes drew momentary outrage, and sometimes led to a burst of charitable giving, but they faded quickly, replaced by parliamentary debates and foreign wars. Pamphlets circulated in wealthier districts, often unsigned, or written under the cover of a pen name, calling for reform. They were sold in railway stations and handed out near churches, printed on grey paper that stained the fingers. Their tone was urgent, but always framed by distance. The authors used phrases like "those unfortunate souls" and "the unseen masses," as though describing an illness or an abstract sorrow. They did not know names. They rarely knew faces. Occasionally, an official inquiry would be launched, a commission, with minutes recorded and witnesses summoned. Policemen gave testimony about moving vagrants from doorsteps. Medical officers described the effects of cold on the elderly. Parish wardens recited the number of beds available in a given district. The inquiries always ended with conclusions. recommendations, circulars, advice. The result was more paper, more ink, no warmth. Even the reformers, those rare few who walked the alleys and knocked on the doors of doss houses, often wrote about the homeless, not as individuals, but as types. The honest fallen man, the poor widow, the incorrigible vagrant. These types made for easier narrative, for cleaner appeals to donors and government boards. Complexity, after all, did not fit neatly into a fundraising letter, and still, there were flickers, small, careful attempts to see the poor as people. Henry Mayhew, in his sprawling interviews compiled for the Morning Chronicle, tried to write as they spoke. His accounts, though filtered, carried the cadence of real voices, the bone picker explaining her trade, the match girl describing her earnings, the child thief recounting how he chose his marks. These were not imagined scenes, but imperfect portraits, still seen through the gaze of a middle-class observer, but closer than most dared go. Yet for every Mayhew, there were 10 more who viewed the poor through fogged glass. Their observations were shaped not by proximity, but by expectation. They expected vice, and found it. They expected filth, and noted it in paragraphs of repulsion. They expected laziness, and pointed to idle bodies with shaking heads. The homeless remained, even in writing, at arm's length, watched, pitied, but never embraced. Libraries began to swell with volumes on poverty, reports from the Royal Commission on the Housing of the Working Classes, papers by Charles Booth, who would later map the entire city by colour, black for the lowest class, yellow for the wealthy. These maps were detailed, meticulous, and chilling. Streets reduced to shades of fortune, entire communities defined by tone. Still, the writing continued. Clergymen published sermons on Christian duty. Ladies' magazines included stories of fallen women redeemed by missions. Reform societies issued annual reports with tables and charts. And throughout it all, the homeless walked, unlettered, uncounted in the days between censuses, sleeping beneath statistics. Few of them read what was written. Fewer still saw their own lives reflected in the pages. The paper, rough and grey, bore little resemblance to the stone they slept on. Ink could capture numbers, even names, but not ache, not hunger, not the weight of another night coming without promise. Even so, the writing mattered. It shaped opinion, it built laws, it created the scaffolding on which later reforms would climb. It gave future generations a faint echo of what had been endured. But in the present, in the fog-drenched silence of another London dusk, the words did not warm. They did not feed. They simply gathered, like coal dust, in the corners of the archive. The stone did not warm with sunlight. Even in summer, the carved marble and cast-iron figures stood cold, indifferent. Memorials of kings and generals, pillars for peace, statues of victory, all unmoved by the slow suffering that curled itself at their base. London's parks and squares, dressed in imperial symbolism and national pride, held another layer, quieter and unmarked. In the shadows behind fountains, along the grass edges near railings, and at the feet of bronzed heroes, the homeless settled each evening like fallen leaves, never meant to be there, but always there just the same. Hyde Park, with its wide gravel walks and tree-lined avenues, was a favourite for those who had nowhere else to go. In the day it belonged to promenading ladies, carriage horses, and children in white collars running with hoops. But as dusk bled into the city's edges, the figures changed. Slow-moving shapes took to the benches, hunched, quiet, wrapped in layers of old cloth. Others lay curled beneath the cover of the Serpentine's bridge, too low to be noticed, unless one looked directly down, but few ever did. The statues watched. The Duke of Wellington, astride his charger, cast his shadow across the damp earth where a child now slept. The Victoria Fountain trickled beside a woman who had not moved in hours. The Albert Memorial rose in Gothic splendour, while just beyond the iron fence, a man leaned against a tree, trying to stay upright, too sore to lie down. These juxtapositions were neither rare nor commented upon. They were simply part of the city's rhythm. The ceremony above, the collapse below, other squares bore the same contrasts. In Trafalgar, the lions stood their eternal guard, flanking Nelson's towering column. Tourists came in daylight to gaze upwards, to read plaques and pose with pigeons. But at night, the same stone plinths gave shelter from the wind. Bodies pressed into the lee of their bases, out of sight, out of the worst of the cold. The granite steps turned beds, their surfaces hard but flat, predictable. Around the corner, St. Martin in the Fields opened its portico to the chill. Columns that had once echoed with sacred purpose, now framing silhouettes that barely stirred. These were not places designed for rest. There were no cushions, no roofs, no welcome. The grass was often too wet to lie on. The benches were curved to discourage lingering. Railings enclosed statues, separating them from the uninvited. But still, each night, the parks filled, never loudly, never in crowds, but piece by piece, like mist settling across the ground. Those who came did so silently, with practiced caution, knowing which park keepers looked away, and which did not. They learned where the foot patrols passed, and how long the shadows lasted before the moon shifted. Knowledge earned through exposure. In Green Park, the lawns dipped slightly near Constitution Hill, forming shallow hollows that offered the faintest protection. In the cold months, these became nests of shawls and broken boots. On the steps of the Wellington Arch, just before midnight, one could sometimes see silhouettes etched against the sky, not statues, but living bodies, still and small beneath towering stone. The great memorials had been raised for remembrance, for victories long past and for men long dead. Their engravings spoke of sacrifice, of glory, of the shaping of empire. They stood in marble robes or atop plinths, faces frozen in idealized calm. Around them, the city grew and shifted. Soot stained their shoulders, birds nested in the crevices, ivy crawled up forgotten plaques. But the statues themselves endured, unblinking, immaculate, silent, and beneath them, real lives broke slowly. Those who huddled by war memorials rarely read the names. There were too many, and they were too high up. The bronze letters meant little to someone trying to stretch a last crust of bread across another day. But there was something in the presence of these monuments. Not comfort, exactly, but permanence. The homeless, moved on by constables, chased from shop fronts, denied entry at the doss house door, could still find a kind of stillness here. Because the statues did not move. They did not ask questions. They offered a surface that could not be taken away. In some corners of the city, charitable missions sent volunteers to the parks at dusk. Tea in tin cups, biscuits in paper, a few words murmured and forgotten. Some read scripture, others merely handed out blankets. But most of those who came to rest near the fountains or railings did not ask for help. They had long stopped asking. They had learned to exist on the edges of awareness, to become part of the scenery, not unlike the statues themselves. London's glory had always been built in layers. On top, the domes, the gas lamps, the theatres, beneath the soot, the sweat, the mud, and lower still, the unseen, people whose names were never carved into stone, whose bones never lay in marked graves, whose nights were passed beside public monuments they did not build and could not enter. The city's planners had filled the urban landscape with symbols of conquest, of monarchy, of honor. They had not imagined these same places as shelter, and yet the bronze and granite proved more enduring than pity. The statues did not vanish when funds ran dry. The plinths did not close their gates at night. In the morning the park would belong again to dogs, nannies, and the idle wealthy. The benches would be empty or freshly claimed, the litter collected, the grass brushed, but traces remained. The impressions in the soil, the faint warmth left by a human form pressed to stone. No record, no inscription, just a life passed in silence, beneath a face carved into marble. Even for those who had no address, no coin, no bed, there were still lines. Long, slow-moving, barely human queues that formed in the grey light of early morning, or under the dripping eaves of a parish office. The city had created a system for the destitute, though its arms reached slowly, and often not at all. There were ledgers and boxes, papers and stamps, ink-stained desks, and men behind counters, who never had to sleep outside. The process began early. The hopeful, if one could still call them that, began to gather before the buildings opened. Some had heard a rumor of relief, a meal, a spare cot, a chance to break stones for pennies. Others came because it was something to do, something to stand in, somewhere to be. It was not rest, but it resembled purpose, and that was rare enough. The queues formed outside the parishes, the poor law unions, and the district boards. The architecture was often old, red brick, blackened with soot, or plaster faded to a sickly cream. Wrought iron gates marked the entrances, often shut until the precise minute allowed. Inside, clerks moved slowly with pens, blotters, and the careful caution of men whose jobs were safe. They asked questions without looking up: name, occupation, place of birth, religion. Could you read? Had you worked? Were you married? Did you drink? The answers were whispered, mumbled, invented. Sometimes it did not matter. The answers rarely changed the outcome. A stamp, a nod, a rejection. The line moved forward one place. Some had queued in the same spot every week for years. They learned the patterns, which days to come for bread, which for shelter, which for the slim hope of work. And they learned the sound of disappointment before it was spoken. The quiet shuffle backwards, the sigh, the way the shoulders sank. The long queue for nothing was not always empty-handed, but it was nearly always thankless. Even charity had its ledger. Forms were precious. Forms meant record, and record meant possibility, of inclusion, of consideration, however brief. But forms also disappeared. They were lost, misplaced, refiled. Men and women waited weeks for a paper to be processed, only to be told it never existed. They would need to begin again, reapply, get in line, and so the queue remained. Never short, always shifting, like the city itself. In some places, the queue was for work, dock labor, if the river was busy, sweepers for the roads, stone breakers for the yards. These jobs paid little, and often only lasted a day, but they were better than nothing. The line for such labor formed under signs chalked on boards: able-bodied men only, present before 6. Dozens stood, hundreds. Some days, the foreman came with his book, picked a few, and turned the rest away. It was always arbitrary. A strong back, a familiar face, a pair of boots less torn than the others. Other queues led to missions or charitable halls, places where soup was ladled in metal bowls, where tea came in chipped mugs. Here the lines were quieter, almost reverent. Women with children stood close together. Old men leaned on sticks or walls. The smell of boiled potatoes, weak broth, damp wool, and ash drifted out long before the doors opened. There were no questions here, only portions, just enough to remember the taste of food, not enough to forget hunger. Some of the longest lines were those outside of poor houses during particularly bitter months. Rumors spread quickly in the street: a new superintendent, a spare dormitory, warm bedding. Often they were untrue. But the queue formed anyway. It cost nothing to stand. Only time, which the homeless had in grim abundance. And all the while the clerks remained behind their windows. The windows were small, set in stone or wood, with narrow slits for passing papers through. The men behind them wore waistcoats and sleeves tucked at the elbow. Their pens scratched slowly, and they rarely looked up. The queue did not require them to look. A woman with a baby might be turned away for lack of proof. No baptismal record, no marriage certificate. A man with a limp might be denied work for appearing weak. A boy too young to hold papers of his own might be passed over entirely, and they would all step out of line, as if by instinct, without complaint. They were used to it. The silence was its own language. Few spoke in the queue. There was nothing to say. The queue was not a place of conversation but of resignation, of waiting because one had no power to move any other way. And yet they stood, day after day, because sometimes one did get picked. A space did open, a paper did come through. The chance was small, but it was larger than the cold. At the end of the day, as offices closed and lanterns were lit, the queues dissolved. Some wandered off to search again for sleep under the arches. Others drifted toward the river, or toward the parks where they might not be chased away. The forms they had waited for would be processed. Eventually, or not. There would be another queue tomorrow. London was a city of lines, rail lines, telegraph lines, political lines, class lines, and beneath them all, the human ones, figures standing in frost or drizzle, feet numb, bellies hollow, hands empty, waiting for a door that might never open. There was no announcement, no flurry of concern, just an absence, someone who had been there every morning, every week, and then was not. One less figure leaning against the bricks, one less shape huddled under a shawl, one less pair of feet wrapped in rags, waiting for the same bowl of broth. The city did not pause, the stones did not mark the missing, and those still living learned not to ask. It was dangerous to keep count. Death was not a visitor to the homeless of Victorian London. It was a slow shadow, always nearby, always watching. It did not always come swiftly. More often, it arrived by degrees. First the limbs stiffened in the cold, then the cough started, then the weight dropped, the color drained, and the steps slowed. Eventually the body simply gave in, folding onto a step, a pile of hay in a stable, a corner near the canal, or the edge of a park. It might remain there through the night, mistaken for sleep, or it might be found by a watchman at dawn, nudged with a boot, unmoving. If there was still breath in the lungs, the body might be taken to a hospital, St. Bartholomew say, or Guy's, if space allowed. But usually the poor did not die in beds. They expired beneath bridges, behind slaughterhouses, or up against the side of a public urinal. They coughed into silence in the alleys, or slipped away behind crates in the backs of shops long closed. Their deaths were quiet, undramatic, not the stuff of Dickens or reform speeches, but of stillness, bodies simply vanishing from the rhythm of the city. Sometimes they were found in the Thames. The river bore many secrets, and sometimes it gave one up. The authorities would drag out the shape, swollen and pale, and attempt to identify it. If there were no papers, no one to claim the body, it would go to the coroner, then to a pauper's burial. No stone, no service. Just a trench, and a name if one could be guessed. And if no name, then simply a number in the ledgers of death. The city's burial clubs offered a strange form of mercy. For a few pence a week, often paid with difficulty, poor families could secure the right to a modest funeral, a coffin, a grave, perhaps a borrowed mourning veil. But the homeless had no such contributions stored away. They died with nothing, and were buried with the same. Their passing was handled by the parish or by the state, which meant it was done cheaply, in bulk, in the cemetery grounds of St. Pancras of Newington, and beyond. Common graves were opened in long rows. Bodies were stacked together, not all at once, but over time, a few one day, a few more the next. Each one marked on a registry, but rarely marked above ground. No visitors came, no flowers. The soil was tamped down, and the space used again in the years to come. Others were buried at the edge of existing plots, squeezed between stones or under walkways where feet passed daily, and some were never buried at all in the usual sense. Their bodies went to hospitals for dissection, or to medical schools, where students learned from what had once been someone with a name. These corpses were rarely claimed. Few noticed their vanishing. Death came in many forms. Consumption hollowed lungs, dysentery drained the body, typhus flickered through the hostels and tenements, and always, the cold, the long, unforgiving chill of damp brick and iron railings, of straw beds that never held warmth. Few among the homeless survived winter after winter. Age came fast. At 35, one might already stoop, wheeze and limp. Many did not make it to 40. There was no mourning in the street, no candles lit, no bells tolled for the poor who passed on. At best, a fellow sleeper might note the absence and mutter a prayer. At worst, the space was quickly filled, the body forgotten, and the cycle resumed. The death registers recorded these lives in ink, if at all. Unidentified male, approx. Age 50, found near Bishopsgate. Female, believed to be Mary Ann Cess. No known family, died of exposure. Some were simply marked, unknown, vagrant, dead on arrival. The press sometimes noted a case if it was particularly tragic or timely. Destitute woman perishes in alley. Infant found dead in basket. The articles were small, factual, without much sentiment. They served their purpose, a flicker of attention before the paper was folded, and the day moved on. Yet even in death, the homeless remained part of the fabric of the city. They lay beneath its cemeteries, filled its hospitals, and haunted the memories of those who had once known them. They were the ones who disappeared, yet never fully left. Their names may have been erased, but their shapes remained in the shadows, in the soot, in the air breathed by a city that never truly saw them. And so London went on, a city of steam and empire, of clocks and carriages, and beneath all that, beneath the arches and behind the railings, the homeless continued to die, one by one, quietly, unceremoniously, folded into the stone and soil of the great metropolis. The city did not write elegies, but it remembered, not in books or poems or sermons, but in the softened corners of stone steps, the chipped thresholds of boarding houses, the sloped edges of rain-worn gutters. In the city's body, memory did not fade, it simply became texture. Each cobblestone, worn smooth by the press of foot and cartwheel, held a trace of those who had walked it with no destination. The soot-blackened walls, once whitewashed and fresh, now bore the stain of endless winters, and the brush of cold shivering shoulders that leaned against them for support. Where names disappeared from ledgers and faces were lost to the fog of time, the streets carried on without forgetting. In some alleyways, narrow and almost forgotten, there were marks on the brick, faint scratches from crates pulled along in the dark, or from boots slipping in the rain. In corners where shop boys once crouched beside bundles of rags and bone pickers sorted through filth, the stones remained dark with old oil and ash. Dust from coal fires had settled there, and never left. Ash from burned scraps of food still lived between the cracks. Even the river, glistening under a sickly light, seemed to carry memory in its depths. The Thames had seen the slow deaths, the cast-off belongings, the quiet disappearances. It had lapped against the banks as figures bent low, searching for scraps, for bones, for anything the tide might return. The mud held footprints that vanished with every current, but even then something of the weight remained, pressed into the shore like breath into cold glass. Beneath bridges and behind courtyards, the homeless had gathered for decades. Their shapes had leaned against the same beams, sat on the same steps, stared through the same fog. The city did not remember them in stories or statues, but in the dim places, the gaps behind bakeries, the rear walls of chapels, the underside of stairwells, time stood still. Dust collected, but nothing was erased. Above these spaces, brick houses changed hands, curtains were changed, gas fittings upgraded, carpets laid over creaking floorboards, but the foundations stayed the same, and they knew. Each floor had trembled once with hunger upstairs, and breathless sleep below. The banisters had been gripped by thin hands coming down in the dark, passing unnoticed into the street. Cellar doors had opened and shut, releasing men who'd begged for a job, a crust or nothing at all. At the corners where lanes met courts and courtyards turned into open markets, the paving stones bore deeper wear, tiny dips like cupped palms in the road, not made by carts or wagons, but by the slow erosion of human passage, beggars dragging feet, children darting barefoot in the wet, or widows shifting from one doorway to another, before the morning light forced them into motion. There was no plaque, no marker, no ribbon cut for remembrance, yet London's very skin bore the lines of those it had once turned away. The past did not vanish, it embedded itself, in iron railings with flaked paint, where young boys once rested after long nights selling matches, in the deep-set frames of warehouses, where men crouched in the rain, pressed into the shadows of goods that never belonged to them. Even the lamp-posts, those flickering guardians of the midnight city, had once served as sentinels to misery. Against their iron trunks, figures had leaned for warmth, for balance, for hope, and at their bases, coins had been dropped, heads had bowed, and sometimes, the lifeless had rested. All boards to cheese. Inside the churches, floors were polished and organs well tuned, but on the steps outside, the stones bore the wear of those who had sat for hours, silent and unmoving. A child once curled near a gate, A man once slumped with frost on his beard. The gospel had sounded inside, but it was out here that the body left its mark. The railings of London were among the most silent of witnesses. They were always there, blackened, cold, sharp to the touch, and against them shoulders had pressed, arms had wrapped tight in shivering repose, faces had leaned into them in the small hours, when even sleep refused to come. No one remembered those moments, but the iron did, even now, long after the newspapers stopped printing the word destitute, and the censors ceased to count vagrants as carefully. The evidence remained. In buildings turned into offices, where once soup kitchens steamed and lines shuffled past, in flats built atop what had once been lodging yards, rope beds, and coffin cubicles, in polished cafes that once served as stables, and libraries that were once doss houses. A century passes easily in a city like London. Empires rise and fall, names change, fashion shifts. But bricks and stones, they are slow to forget. They absorb, they endure. There are doorways now that are sealed shut, steps that lead to nowhere, grates that open into forgotten tunnels. These are not relics, they are records. Of the child who slept with his arms around his knees, of the woman in grey who stared through the window at a fire that would never warm her, of the boy who vanished one fog-heavy dawn, never to return to his place by the lamppost, all still there, all recorded in silence. The city might have turned its gaze away, but the ground did not. The stones, scarred and worn, remain, watching, holding the shape of every life that once passed over them in hunger and hope, in despair and in final sleep. The rain falls without pause now, not a storm, not a downpour, just the endless grey drizzle of a London that never truly dries, the kind that settles into the mortar, sinks into wool, and stains the brick blacker with each year. Somewhere in the heart of the city, a bell tolls from a church no one enters anymore. In the distance, a barrow wheel rolls over slick stones, slow and creaking, and beneath it all, as ever, silence holds steady. London breathes on. It hums and pulses with life, with schedules, with the weight of thousands of footsteps. Trains move beneath the ground, lorries grumble down old roads, lights flicker to life in windows that once looked down on slums and workyards. But in all that clatter and brightness, there are absences no one names. The homeless of Victorian London, the forgotten majority of a forgotten century, left no monuments. There are no statues in their honor, no plaques in the parks, no dates in textbooks. What remains are lines in ledgers, blurred names in burial books, and thin mentions in parliamentary reports. They remain, if at all, in the footnotes, in the dull bureaucratic observations of inspectors, clergymen, and reformers who once walked the streets and jotted down the condition of a life in 6 words or fewer. Male, aged 30. No fixed abode. Infant, found near Blackfriars Bridge. Widow, no family, no income. And so they pass, not even as ghosts, but as faded ink and forgotten margins, unwitnessed, unmourned. Most were never photographed, their voices never recorded, their thoughts never preserved. And yet, the city they occupied, the doorways they leaned against, the cellar stairs they descended, the soup lines they stood in, the rope beds they rented, it all carried on. London was always too large to notice every life it swallowed. They died under bridges and behind shops, in lodging house corners and on frost-covered cobbles. They were gathered in the early hours by cart, and carried to hospitals, or buried at parish cost, a number in a ledger. The streets were washed, the silence returned, and the city moved forward, because cities do. They grow and rebuild and rebrand. Streets are renamed, buildings are repurposed, parks are manicured, the old soot is scraped away, and the fog lifts, but the history underneath remains intact, just hidden, just layered beneath new paint, new paving, new prosperity. Their lives, cold, brief, unseen, form the invisible scaffolding of modern London. Not the cathedrals or towers, but the quiet gaps in the map, the lanes that never quite join, the steps that descend to nowhere, the bricked-up doors and the rusted hooks on alley walls. These are what remains. You might pass one now and not see it. A dip in the cobbles near a junction, a curve in the railings where someone once sat, a vent that hums faintly beside a church wall, where a woman once slept for warmth. No marker tells you, no voice explains, but still, it's there. History is not only made by those who wrote it down, often it is carried by those who left no record, whose hands touched the same stone 1,000 times, who walked the same path every dusk, who passed away without anyone knowing their last name. They shaped the city through endurance alone, through the wear they left on the world, and though London did not speak their names, it cannot erase their traces. Now, in the softened quiet of the present, when the streets have thinned and the night is low and heavy again, there is a strange comfort in knowing they were here, that the city has always been both triumph and struggle, always a cathedral of light surrounded by shadows, and those shadows are not empty. They are full of those who walked unseen, slept standing, ate sparingly, and disappeared without fuss. They are gone, but not undone. They are in the stones, in the gaps, in the silences. And so, as we close this long walk through fog and hunger, through soot and stillness, remember that even the quietest lives leave a shape behind. You might not notice it in the day, but at night, when the gas lamps flicker low, and the streets grow empty once again, London remembers. It always remembers. If you're still with me, thank you for walking slowly through these long quiet hours of the past. Let me know in the comments where and when you're listening from. It's always a quiet pleasure to hear from different corners of the world, and if this story helped ease you into rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these calm journeys through forgotten places and lives. Until next time, keep the light low, and may your rest be deeper than the city's silence. Good night.